Now, I think we have everybody joining us this morning. Okay, good morning, and you are all very welcome to our interactive breakfast webinar ahead of next week's State of the European Union address by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And today's discussion has been organised by the European Parliament Liaison Office in Dublin, the European Commission representation in Ireland, and of course the European Movement Ireland. Now, it has been an eventful few weeks on the European front, with, of course, the resignation of Phil Hogan as European Commissioner for Trade and the announcement this week that Mairead McGuinness will be the new Commissioner with responsibility for financial services, financial stability and capital markets, pending approval of the European Parliament. And of course, next week's State of the European Union address is taking place against the backdrop of COVID-19. And late in July, of course, the EU leaders agreed a €750 billion recovery fund and also signed off on an almost €1.1 trillion 7-year budget. Now, the impact of the pandemic on European economies will no doubt feature strongly in her address next week, along with other key priorities. And we do have an indication of those priorities because when she addressed the European Parliament last year, pending her election as European Commission President, she outlined them. And of course, the big ticket items are a European Green Deal, a new digital strategy, and of course, the European Child Guarantee to ensure access for children to healthcare and education. Now, when Ursula von der Leyen addressed the Parliament last year, she also stressed the need for a greater voice for the Parliament and for European citizens. And on that note this morning, we're going to hear from those representing Irish business, trade unions, farming, environmental, charity and youth sectors to find out what they want her to prioritise in her State of the Union address next week. And we're also going to be hearing from some of our elected representatives. They're first going to get an opportunity to assess the contributions of those sectoral bodies and then to express their own, I suppose, interests and what they want to see her highlight next week. We will also be getting the views of members of the public, and you can press your question and answer button on the screen and provide your questions or comments on today's webinar. Now, the event is also being streamed live on the Facebook pages of the European Parliament Liaison Office in Dublin, the European Commission representation in Ireland, and the European Movement Ireland. So there is no excuse to be looking on. So let me first introduce our range of speakers, and we are joined by Noelle O'Connell, the Executive Director of the European Movement Ireland, Tim Cullinan, President of the Irish Farmers Association, Deirdre Garvey, the Chief Executive of the Wheel, which represents 9,000 charities here, Patricia King, General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Union, Danny McCoy, Chief Executive of the Irish Business and Employers Confederation, Dr. Elaine Mcguff from the Environmental Pillar, which is a coalition of 33 NGOs working to promote sustainable solutions, Robert Nesirky from the National Youth Council of Ireland. Now, as we mentioned, Ursula von der Leyen will be addressing and delivering her State of the European Union address in the European Parliament and, of course, in Brussels. And we are delighted to be also joined by elected representatives, including Fianna Fáil MEP Barry Andrews, who represents the Dublin constituency, and Fine Gael's MEP Sean Kelly, who represents Ireland South and has done so for for more than a decade. Now, in terms of the format, some just quick housekeeping business, and then we're down to business. Each of the speakers will first of all be given 3 minutes to outline what they would like Ursula von der Leyen to outline in her address next week. And I will notify the speakers when they reach, when they've just 20 seconds left in their speech so they can start wrapping up. There will then be a panel discussion, and then we'll go to questions and answers from our audience. And by the way, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag SOTEU, which stands of course for State of the Union EU. So without further ado, I'm going to start off proceedings with our first speaker, Noelle O'Connell, Executive Director of European Movement Ireland, who's also going to give some opening remarks. Thank you. Noelle.
Thank you, Martina. As CEO of European Movement Ireland, I'm delighted to be involved in this advance State of the Union address briefing, and I would like to commend the European Parliament and European Commission offices in Ireland for their foresight in bringing together today's timely event. I will, of course, be cognizant of time, but I promise if I do lapse and break the rules, it will only be for a very specific and limited way. Fair to say, it has been a momentous run-in to next Wednesday's State of the Union, set as it is amidst the backdrop of a global pandemic, as Martina outlined, that has seen COVID result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people across Europe. And Eurostat has stated that EU GDP levels are down 11.9% in Q2 2020, which is the biggest drop since the analysis started in 1995. And in addition, we have seen the hugely worrying developments played out in Westminster only this week. And so in President von der Leyen's State of the Union address on the 16th of September, from a European Movement Ireland perspective, I hope the following features. Firstly, that we see a detailed roadmap to recovery. Secondly, the commitment to deliberative democracy initiatives that hear the concerns and engage the views of all Europeans. Thirdly, the promise of sustained social responsibility. And finally, an EU that is not afraid to lead on the global stage, a European Union that defends and champions the upholding of the founding values of our shared union. So firstly, next week, I hope that we see a framework for sustainable recovery focused on the dual green and digital transitions, possessing a substantial social component that protects employment and enterprise and ensures economic prosperity. The European Green Deal and digitalisation are central to the EU's future prosperity, and initiatives from InvestEU to the Just Transition Fund have only just begun laying the foundations for that necessary greener Europe. And what we see happening in Poland and Hungary and only this past couple of days closer to home, I hope to find a commitment to the democratic values that lie at the very heart of the EU in the State of the Union address. The rule of law is the fulcrum for our European values, protecting and reinforcing them. And I hope we see a programme of engagement that promotes those fundamental values and outlines a common, united, constructive approach to addressing the rule of law issues. Crucial to this are initiatives such as the annual rule of law report and deliberative democratic exercises such as the Conference on the Future of Europe, which the Council has called on to be launched as soon as COVID conditions permit. This is something that we in European Movement Ireland would be calling for all EU institutions to be fully ambitious in supporting its comprehensive delivery and rollout. Thirdly, I hope we see the promise of a sustained social responsibility. Notwithstanding the slow start, the COVID crisis has demonstrated the significance of European solidarity. In the time of global pandemics, however, it is critical that this European solidarity extends beyond Europe's borders to our neighbouring partners. The protests in Belarus, the conflict in Libya, the consequences of the Syria crisis, issues in the Sahel and in eastern Ukraine are all issues that Europe must play a constructive leadership role in addressing. And my final hope for the State of the Union is for hope itself. When we see a retreat on the global stage from a commitment to multilateralism, allied to a decline in respect for democracy, human rights and the rule of law, and when we are witnessing a worrying rise in the forces of nationalism, populism and extremism, I hope that next week's State of the Union address will be bold, brave and ambitious. And in a world that seems increasingly politically divided and embattled, that President von der Leyen's address won't be reticent next week in proactively advocating for the values of the European Union as a much needed beacon of hope and inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Noelle. Now we're going to move on to farming matters. There are a lot of big issues affecting Irish farmers on the EU agenda, including, of course, Brexit and the €5 billion EU contingency fund to help those affected, the new Common Agricultural Policy, and of course the Commission President's ambitious plans in relation to sustainable farming. And I'm sure some, if not many of those issues will be raised by our next speaker, Tim Cullinan, the President of the IFA. Tim.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be speaking here this morning on the advance of the State of the Union address by the President of the EU Commission next week. And rightly, as you mentioned, there's two key issues I want to discuss. The first one obviously is Brexit and where that is at is very worrying, and the other one is CAP reform and the Green Deal. But I'll kick off on Brexit, and obviously this is very, very concerning for Irish agriculture, as 37% of the food and drink that's produced here in Ireland is exported into the UK. 29% go to international markets, and 34% of the remainder go into other EU markets. We export approximately 50% of the beef produced here in Ireland into the UK market. So obviously, this is, from a Brexit point of view, this is very worrying for us. And I suppose what we need is, obviously we want a continuation of the closest possible future trading relationship that maintains the value of the EU market or the UK market for Irish farmers. And so this is critical for us. And for that to continue, we need a tariff-free and quota-free access to the UK market. We need a level playing field where the UK maintains corresponding standards on food safety, animal health, environment, and on all of those issues. We do not want to return by the UK to a cheap food policy, so that their external tariffs and import quotas for sensitive products such as beef, butter and lamb do not undercut EU farmers. We also want for the GB trade to Northern Ireland. We're looking for the closest SPS and customs checks and controls on all live animals and agri-food products coming into Northern Ireland. We do not want a situation where Northern Ireland could end up as a backdoor for cheap product coming into Ireland. I suppose our other ask directly from the EU is, in July, the European Council agreed on a Brexit adjustment reserve worth 5 billion. We have been campaigning consistently on that, and I think we are going to need a substantial amount of that money for Irish agriculture in the event that we end up with a no-deal scenario. If we end up back with WTO rules, it's going to be absolutely devastating for Irish farming. So on Brexit, there are more or less our key asks. But moving on to CAP, and Ireland has secured in July a CAP budget of 10.73 billion, which can be co-funded up to 57% by our own government here at home. And if we look at what CAP does for Ireland, first of all, there's in excess of 173,000 people employed in the agri-business here in Ireland. So this is essential for not just for Irish farmers, but it's spread out right across the local communities. It provides jobs in all the rural and local areas in Ireland. Agriculture is 8% of the GNI here in Ireland, so it's a very important sector in the economy. And
time, Tim.
Yeah, on the Green Deal, we have a farm to fork biodiversity, and we have an eco scheme in Pillar 1. I am asking next week that the President relooks at this. These are aspirational asks. What's been asked here that Irish and European farmers have to produce food with less land, less products to do that. And another point there is on carbon capture. I want to ensure that the EU will reward Irish farmers for the capture of carbon. We want to play our part in the Green Deal, as in renewable energy and reducing emissions for Ireland Inc. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And as you can see there are lots of issues for Irish farmers on the EU agenda at the moment. And I'm sure Tim could do a full hour's talk in terms of all the issues he needs to get into. Now, fighting poverty and ensuring children have access to healthcare and education are among the priorities of this Commission, and we are all very aware of the great work that is done by Irish charities in these areas. However, earlier this year there was a very stark warning from the sector about the impact of COVID-19 on fundraising. So against this backdrop, Deirdre Garvey, the Chief Executive of the Wheel, is going to outline what she wants to hear in Ursula von der Leyen's State of the European Union address next week. Deirdre.
Thank you very much, Martina, and thank you to EMI, the Commission and Parliament representations in Ireland for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to it. And I think the word we in the Wheel, knowing the impact that this crisis has had on charities, community and voluntary sector, generally civil society, I think we don't understand and fully appreciate the contribution that this sector makes, not just to the work that it does in terms of the services it provides, but also to the economic and I guess productivity of this country. There is a turnover of 14.5 billion in the Irish charity, community and voluntary sector, and it employs almost 200,000 people. So the areas that I would like to see reflected in the President's State of the Union address are social economy, citizen engagement, sustainable recovery and Green Deal. Social economy first. Right now, citizens, people, communities, companies and enterprises of all sorts, including civil society organisations, are suffering from the consequences. We know we're in a deep recession. It's widening the social divergences and economic divergences across the regions and in the member states. It jeopardises the cohesion of our union. Urgent action is needed, and the importance of the cohesion policy, and in particular the European Social Fund, must continue to be used as key instruments for social convergence, inclusion and quality job creation through support and incentives for the 2.8 million social economy enterprises and organisations, which are very often charities and community and voluntary organisations in this country. So if the transformations that are to be needed now and stated already are to be successful, the social economy and civil society have to be enabled to play their role within societies and the economy. Secondly, citizen engagement, and we welcome in the Wheel the support that significant progress has been made by the Commission and the Union to increase engagement with civil society organisations and citizens. We know from the 2020 work programme that there will be a new conference on the future of Europe, engaging citizens to shape the future. So what we really hope is that the President's vision for participation is as inclusive and wide-reaching as possible, supporting the involvement of all Europeans and particularly hard-to-reach group. We like to think that the realities of people's lives are strongly reflected in this process, and our experience really needs to show that it has to be an ongoing process and more than a one-off. So we really invite her to lead out on processes that are innovative, meaningful, ongoing, ultimately strengthening citizens' belief in the value of European citizenship. Thirdly, sustainable recovery. And after presenting its first ideas on the Strong Social Europe in January 2020, the Commission does promise to embed the twin digital and climate transitions into the unique social market economy, while also ensuring social fairness, sustainability and economic growth. And we hope to hear the President put people and communities at the centre of these transitions, guaranteeing that no one is left behind. Economic and trade policies must support social and environmental goals and objectives, not hinder them. So we'll be interested to hear how the President can balance these two competing areas. And lastly and fourthly, the Green Deal, about which many people will speak today, I'm sure. At the Wheel, we welcome the European Union's ambitious Green Deal. We really wish to hear the President's outline a vision for sustainability that is community-led and supporting communities and people to be socially resilient, environmentally healthy and economically strong in as all degrees as possible, as much as possible. So in concluding, these values of solidarity, strong social cohesion and the principle of no one being left behind, they are really, I guess, layman's language of the founding principles which underpin the EU. I really, really look forward to hearing a State of the Union address by the President, which is clearly marked by the overt presence of these values for all to see. We have to be able to take leadership, and we trust that she will provide that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Deirdre. Now, Ursula von der Leyen previously stressed the need for an EU economy that works for people, and she has promised better working conditions for workers and also for supports for those who lose their jobs. And that was before COVID-19. Now, this is particularly important now in this context. Now, our next speaker will be outlining the priorities of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, which comprises 44 affiliated unions north and south of the border. Would you please welcome the General Secretary of ICTU, Patricia King.
Thank you very much, Martina, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to make this short address on behalf of the 700,000 workers across the island who are represented by ICTU and its affiliates. So in view of the time available, I'll get straight to the point and focus on 3 issues of national interest that I would like to see the President of the European Union address next week. So the first obviously concerns Europe's response to the economic fallout of COVID-19. So ICTU welcomed the European Council's adoption in July of the 1.8 trillion EU recovery plan, and obviously it was in stark contrast to the change from Europe's disastrous response to the 2008 crisis. However, there are aspects of deep concern, and from our point of view, they do require clarification, particularly the unacceptable cuts to the Just Transition Fund from 40 billion to 17 billion. The EU for Health programme cut from 9.4 billion to 1.7 billion, as well as the cancellation of the solvency support instrument. So I'd like to hear the Commission President's outline and how she intends to reverse these decisions. I'd also like to hear her outline of how the social dimension of the plan can be strengthened, including civil societies and indeed trade unions' role in its implementation at all levels. And this leads to the second issue that I'd just like to briefly address. I think most people now have a much greater awareness and appreciation of essential workers. And that awareness is much greater than it would have been prior to the pandemic. And I think that a lot of people acknowledge that these workers are undervalued and underpaid. So in her 2019 political guidelines for 2019 to 2024, the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen described herself as a firm believer in the value of social dialogue between employers and unions. And she committed to proposing legislation to ensure that every worker has a fair minimum wage to be agreed by collective bargaining or by law. So earlier this month, European unions voted overwhelmingly, 85% actually, in favour of a directive that would uphold fair minimum wages and a collective worker voice through collective bargaining in all member states. And I would like to see the Commission President elaborate on this crucial initiative, which I hope to see her make swift political progress at European level over the coming months. And the final issue that I'd like to address, of course, is Brexit, and specifically the risk at the end of the transition period that it would end without agreement for a future relationship with the UK. And the likelihood of this outcome now seems very high. And I would like to make one proposal to try to limit the potential consequences for jobs. Between September and October of last year, the EU amended the European Globalisation Fund to enable it to support workers who might have lost their jobs and had there been a no Brexit. So no deal Brexit. So the legislation was never activated because the UK left the EU on the basis of the withdrawal agreement. However, the prospects now of a no deal Brexit have returned in the form of a transition period ending without the future relationship. And I believe the EU should consider reviving the 2019 amendment to the Globalisation Fund so that workers who might lose their jobs would, when the transition period ends, they may have a better outcome. So I'd ask the Commission President to consider all of that in her address. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and pressing issues there given the current climate. Now, of course, the audience members can submit their questions or comments through the Q&A button on the top of their screens or through the various Facebook pages. Now, the CSO officially confirmed this week that Ireland is in recession, and that of course, amid continuing uncertainty for the business community about Brexit and upcoming trade deals, where there are calls at EU level for changes to the corporate tax systems and a major push for all sectors to reduce emissions. So next week's address is of interest and importance to the Irish Business and Employers Confederation, which has a significant presence and voice in Brussels. Danny McCoy is the Chief Executive of Ibec, and he's here to outline its priorities. Danny.
Thank you, Martina. I might actually just address the specific speech. The President will address the State of the Union, and I think I'd like to see two aspects called out there. One, the place of the Union, and the other, the condition in which the Union is in. And I'm actually reminded of a granduncle of mine who told me that when he went to the United States, having left Tuam at 17, he was asked where was he from. He said Tuam. When the person said, what state is that in? He said, it's in an awful state, that's why I left it. So you have to need to know where a place is and what condition it's in. And so the President really needs to address what condition the Union is in. We've very lofty, high ideals, which we've heard in speech after speech, but the Union is not in a good condition. And that has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed piece by piece, and how to come across this. So the things that need to be in that is, what place does the European Union have? Where is it actually going to be addressed in a world that's becoming increasingly globalized, increasingly driven by intangible assets? And where is the European Union in the globalized world that we're dealing with? We know the populations are declining. We know that the sphere of influence is declining, and having lost a G7 country, the state and the condition of the Union has to be addressed, not in flowery language and in high ideals. They should be a given. That's why we're in the Union. That's why we all signed up to it. But now we need the practical implementation to actually ensure that it's underpinned. And so some of the things that need to be addressed and to be called out are the factors that are on digitalization, green, the sustainability, also in terms of Brexit, in terms of that common approach as to how we're going to deal with Brexit. But Brexit is not just about goods, even though we're obsessed about it at the moment rightly. But we also need to look at the Capital Markets Union, we need to look at the Services Directive, and we also need to know about people's rights and citizens' rights. These are important, but not lofty ideas. We need to start to say, what is the new compact? And I agree with Patricia. Anything that happens at that level needs also a replication here in Ireland and to be discussed in that fashion. And that's why I'd also commend and would like to see that social dialogue dimension, which is going to be required to get everybody to work together like we're going to do this morning, hopefully, see that replicated in Ireland, because the challenges we have here are precisely the ones that Europe has in terms of relevance, in terms of condition, in terms of dealing with COVID, Brexit, green, digital, and so on. So I'd like the President to be honest and practical and not lofty ideals. What is the actual state of the Union? And I think if any of us look at it closely, it's not in a good state. It's in a very precarious state, in fact. And let's face up to that and start to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. And some very straight talking there, I think everybody would agree. And some issues for our question and answer session later. Now, Europe's Green Deal is expected to feature strongly in Ursula von der Leyen's State of the European address. The Commission President wants Europe to become carbon neutral continent by 2050. And of course, that will be music to the ears of our next guest speaker, Dr. Elaine Mcguff from the Environmental Pillar.
Great, thank you very much. All environmental indicators in Ireland are going in the wrong direction. Greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions are going up, half our rivers and lakes are polluted, and our biodiversity is collapsing. We have a biodiversity and climate crisis on our hands. COVID has shown us that we can deal with significant challenges and changes, and that's what is needed to deal with these crises. Devastating as it is, coronavirus is a temporary blip compared to what's coming down the line. There is no vaccine for climate change. And while we welcome the EU biodiversity and farm to fork strategies, we need policies to follow these strategies with sufficient funding and legislation. Without this kind of commitment and funding, these strategies will remain as nothing more than noble ambitions. Against that backdrop, we would like to see the President address the following issues in her State of the Union address. Firstly, we would like to see her talk about CAP. CAP as a policy is failing to deliver for the environment. The EU Court of Auditors reported that greening measures were not effective in reversing biodiversity declines, and intensive farming remains a main cause of biodiversity loss. In short, current CAP impairs our ability to sustainably feed ourselves. But equally, it could be key to addressing our considerable ecological and social challenges. We need a better model with more results-based schemes and public money going for public good. Not the blind per hectare payments, which currently predominantly favour bigger farmers. Now, the farm to fork strategy can help us deliver this, so it's absolutely vital that the new CAP aligns itself with this strategy as much as possible. The second thing we would like the President to address is the enforcement of EU legislation. Europe is built on the rule of law. But if we don't start respecting and enforcing EU legislation, then one of the primary tools for protecting nature is defunct. More resources are needed in DG Envy to tackle complaints to the European Commission on Habitats Directive failures at member state level. Currently, as NGOs, this is our only recourse to secure legal compliance from our government, so we depend on this. And finally, our third ask is that any recovery plan fully supports ecological restoration. We believe that ecological restoration should be a central part of any recovery strategy, as it provides considerable climate and economic benefits. However, we need strong checks and balances to ensure that any green recovery funding actually achieves its aim, that it does provide green measures. COVID has stopped the world in its tracks and exposed major weaknesses in our economic model. We now have an opportunity to rebuild a system which isn't predicated on GDP growth. We need a paradigm shift. We need a paradigm shift to provide a system which values and restores nature, provides food security, and protects our local communities. Our economy and well-being is built on functioning nature, so we very much need to prioritise that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine. And moving on now, Ursula von der Leyen told the European Parliament last year that Europe must support young people throughout their childhood and into adult life. And particularly she focused on those at risk of poverty and social exclusion. Robert Nesirky from the National Youth Council of Ireland will outline this morning what national youth organisations want to hear from the Commission President on this front next week. Robert.
Thank you for the platform and good morning, everyone. So during advocacy moments, many youth activists are told expressly or implicitly that they would receive more attention, more engagement, more platforms if they stopped talking about youth issues and started talking about broader issues. But it's clear at the moment now more than ever that the specific vulnerabilities of young people must not be left unaddressed in the European conversation. There's concerning reports coming from the ILO, the European Youth Forum, and within Ireland from the CSO, highlighting that young people are experiencing a particularly heavy toll from the pandemic and associated crises. So in highlighting three issues, we submit that the European Union and the Irish government have particular roles in tackling one, the youth unemployment crisis, two, European youth mobility uncertainties, and three, the easily solved European youth electoral turnout crisis. So beginning with the latter, from an Irish perspective, in post-EP19 polling, Irish young people were 3 times more likely than the European mean to cite registration bureaucracy as a reason for abstention. And despite a 9% boost in EP19 youth turnout, we're still 5% below the EU mean boost and still massively lagging in overall turnout. So to address this, simply within the programme for government, there was a commitment to establish an electoral commission, and this must be realised ahead of future elections. So second, youth unemployment. The CSO figures for August paint a devastating picture of 38%, nearly 4 out of every 10 young people in the workforce becoming unemployed. The YFJ Global Survey suggests there's a 17% drop internationally in youth employment figures, with young women being disproportionately impacted. So within this space of economic uncertainty and the rampant gig economy, is it worth considering within the framework of the EU Youth Guarantee that the European Commission should look beyond formal employment figures presented by Ireland? Can we ensure that quality of employment is a metric seen as essential as employment figures? Otherwise, young workers and workers' rights more broadly during this crisis and the long recovery. Finally, European mobility and solidarity. So the EU, as others have said, must engage with civil society and the EU youth sector Dialogue with these networks will be essential to uncover hidden vulnerabilities during this crisis and ensure we build back stronger. Further, European civil society is experiencing terrifying open and covert suppression across Europe, and COVID-19 must not be an excuse to cut EU youth programs. It's difficult to overstate exactly how essential these funds are for structural support for CSOs and youth organisations in various European settings and within Ireland. The EU has limited grassroots. It's dependent on these international networks of Europeans to engage citizens. So if these networks are interrupted or stifled, even momentarily during this crisis, then we risk losing institutional memory and part of the fabric of EU democracy being incredibly damaged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, and lots of feedback for our elected representatives to assess and to take in this morning. And of course, Ursula von der Leyen will be addressing MEPs next week in the Parliament. Now, Fianna Fáil's Barry Andrew represents the Dublin constituency. He's our next speaker. He, of course, was previously served as a Minister of State and as a TD. He also is a former Chief Executive of Gold and a former Director General of the Institute of International and European Affairs. And he currently sits on the Parliament's Committee on International Trade, which at this moment in time is very important. Barry.
Thanks, Martina, and good morning to everybody. It's really a great gathering of people this morning to discuss this very important event next week. It'll be my first time attending a State of the Union address, naturally, and obviously President von der Leyen's first time. But this morning, you know, just a quick tot, maybe 1 million people are represented on this discussion this morning between those affiliated with ICTU and Ibec, with farmers, people working in the community and voluntary sector, and indeed the young people and those who identify with the environmental pillar. It's a really valuable exercise, and I dare say saves me and Sean Kelly many, many hours of briefings otherwise. So just 3 issues I will raise, but by way of introduction, the State of the Union address is always in a context. And when President Juncker gave his talk in 2017, he famously used the phrase, "the wind is in our sails," and how things have changed since then. And I think what President von der Leyen will be doing is, as Noelle said at the very beginning, looking to create a path towards recovery and seeking a narrative that demonstrates that the European Union, through its strength, through its the radicalization of what it does in terms of geopolitical work, will be a leader where there is a major void in leadership around the world, reasserting democratic values, reasserting the rule of law at a time when all of that is really at stake and contested. What I expect to see is, as many have already said, is a clear economic recovery pathway. I think there will be a major emphasis on the Green Deal. Already throughout Europe, almost every file that I'm involved with has a sustainability element to it, whether I'm working on the due diligence in supply chains, whether I'm working on sustainable corporate governance. You look at the European Investment Bank and its mission, and it's very focused on sustainability. It pervades every aspect of EU institutional activity. I also expect to see an emphasis on Digital Services Act. I think we will see perhaps a timetable and when that will come onto the agenda in the next few weeks and months. And I think there will also be an emphasis on the EU health. I think it's an area in which we might see an expansion of EU competence over the next while for very, very obvious reasons. And just one last point on green recovery. I do expect to see the President of the Commission commit to 55% reduction, target reduction in relation to 2030, which is an increase from 40%, and it's something the European Parliament called for earlier this week. For my own part, as Martina mentioned, I'm on the Trade Committee and the Development Committee, and they're both sort of externally focused and draw on the President's ambition to have a geopolitical commission. So in terms of trade, obviously it's been very difficult for the last couple of weeks, but I think former Commissioner Hogan emphasized the idea of open strategic autonomy, which means on the one hand, making sure that we have addressed the vulnerabilities of EU supply chains, but at the same time, showing leadership throughout the world to the best extent possible. I also expect her to emphasize the EU partnership with Africa. She visited the African Union headquarters twice in the first 100 days of her time as president, and I think that will come out very strongly, and I very much welcome that, and I hope that she'll address shortcomings in terms of humanitarian aid and its funding in the agreement of the Council back in July. The big debate that's going on right now, and I'll finish on this, Martina, and look forward to any questions, is on how do we fund this very ambitious 1.8 trillion that you mentioned. And I think that figure isn't going to be revisited in terms of the dialogue that's going on during the next few weeks. But what I think we'll have to make some really interesting calls on are, on the one hand, do we continue to cut some of the programs that are on the European agenda, or do we find new own resources? And that's going to be incredibly challenging for Ireland, because lots of individual delegations in our group and elsewhere are looking for obviously common corporate consolidated corporate tax base, financial transactions tax, digital tax. All of this is going to be pressure on Ireland. I haven't even had an opportunity to mention Brexit. I think it's been very well ventilated by other speakers. I hope that's adequate, and I hope I haven't gone over the time, and look forward to questions. Thanks, Martina.
Thank you very much, Barry. And I know that you're leaving at 10 o'clock this morning for another webinar. You're on a conveyor belt, so we will be coming to you shortly for a question. But we're now going to move to your colleague in the European Parliament, Fine Gael Sean Kelly, who has represented Ireland South in the Parliament for more than a decade. He sits on several significant committees, including Industry, Research and Energy, and the International Trade Committee. And in the European Parliament, he is leader of Fine Gael, which of course is a member of the European People's Party, of which Ursula von der Leyen is also affiliated, and I'm sure he has plenty of ideas on what she should highlight next week. Sean.
Thank you, Martina, and good morning, Noelle, and good morning, everybody. Well, what I would like to see Ursula von der Leyen having in her State of the Union address and what actually will be in it mightn't be exactly the same, but certainly I think there will be some points which will be emphasised by her and need to be. And starting with, I think, what McCoy mentioned in relation to the State of the Union as of now. And it's not as good as it should be, not because of the European Commission, not because of the European Parliament, but because of the European Council. And I hope she addresses that, because while we did get an agreement on the Recovery Fund and MFF, there were serious cuts made to programs of added value, such as Horizon Europe. It makes far more sense to be pooling resources to do research than do it in individual countries and individual universities. Yet they cut 13.5 billion from that. I'm the rapporteur for InvestEU, which is a successor to EFSI and the Juncker Fund, and an undoubted success, and they cut 9 billion from that. Why did they do it? And this is where the problem is, and she has to address this. They were renationalising the budget so they could go back to their own countries and say how much they brought back. So that is not the European spirit. I think she'll have to address that, and if she doesn't, she'll get worse rather than better. Now, having said that, the fund itself is, again, it's good because it's the first time we got mutualisation of debt, and that is important to the recovery fund. And also, in fairness to the German presidency, getting the MFF sorted was a good achievement. Now we have to look at how it's going to be done and divide it up, and she will be dealing with that. The recovery will obviously focus on what was her main plank, really, the Green Deal. People have spoken on it, and she will be emphasising that, especially, I think, to get legislation that we will have to be carbon neutral by 2050, and also maybe 55% target. Now, Barry referred to this. My one concern there is that that target could be arbitrary without an impact assessment. But definitely, I agree completely that, and she will be emphasising this, that we have to up our ambition, not leave it as it is or decrease it. But we will see how she will handle that. That will be important. Then, arising also out of COVID, we learned a lot of lessons in relation to digital defects in Europe, and she will be definitely emphasising the necessary strategy there to help people work online. So broadband will have to be given more priority. New technologies will be coming online and helping startups in the whole field. So I think she'll be emphasising a new Digital Services Act, which will incorporate all these and help us to try and get leadership in this whole area, because there's a feeling that we have been somewhat behind the US, Korea and other places. And that is something I think she emphasises a lot. In relation to trade, obviously we'll be looking at what she has to say in relation to developing new markets, but particularly in relation to Brexit. And I do hope that she puts the boot into Boris Johnson and the British government, especially in relation to their intended plan to alter the withdrawal agreement. That is not acceptable. She must say that. I think she must say that we want a deal, but make it very clear also that if the British don't want a deal, the European Union is ready for that. I think she'll be emphasising that once more, and that will be important. As I say, from an Irish context, obviously a trade deal is absolutely vital for us. Tim outlined there the consequences for agriculture. They're phenomenal, really, and that's why that €5 billion fund, if that could be increased in the worst case scenario, that's something we would like to see. And in the whole area of CAP, I think the key there will be that it has to work for farmers. I think that's the point she has to make. I think there's a willingness by all sides that we do need the farm to fork. We do need biodiversity. We do need to have more greening of the CAP, but it must be done in conjunction with the farmers themselves, because they're quite willing to make it work. And if it doesn't work for them, it won't work for the environment. So I think that's an important point, and I think hopefully she will emphasise that. I know in my own group, the EPP, of which she is a member as well, that has something that's been emphasised very much in the last week or two. Also, I just want to say that as a member of the Human Rights Committee, I expect her to address migration, especially the terrible situation in Turkey in relation to Greece and Cyprus, that I'll be willing to stand by Greece and Cyprus and won't take bullying from Turkey. That'll be important. She'll obviously, I think, address Belarus, Ukraine, and of course, own resources is going to be important, because we're all looking for money. Very few are saying how this money is going to be paid back, and I think they will definitely be emphasising own resources, how they can improve that for the European Union, and I think she'll be giving some very clear guidelines on that. One thing she won't mention, which I wouldn't mind if she did, hobby horse of mine, which was mentioned by Juncker last year after a public consultation, daylight savings. That probably won't be mentioned, but I'm totally against the biannual clock change. Ireland, unfortunately, rejected our proposal, but if she doesn't mention it, we might have to look at that again. But aside from that, I think it will be a very good address by her. She did very well the last time. She's a very competent lady. She's practical, and I think she will do very well, and looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Now, as I was making the point there, we have questions coming in from our audience, and I'm going to disperse them with a discussion now. And I would ask all our guest speakers to be mindful of time. Now, one of the issues that came very strongly and was made very pointedly, I think, and Sean mentioned it there, was Danny McCoy's contribution and about the state of the European Union. And I'm going to ask our elected representatives about that, because he clearly said we don't want to hear lofty ideas, and it is at a critical point. And the Belgian ambassador to Ireland, Pierre-Emmanuel Dubau, he has made the point that the stakes are very high at the moment, domestically and internationally, and the EU has a capacity to make the difference, but this capacity is often ill-supported by a narrative, so that communication issue again. So I'm going to first of all ask you, Sean, very briefly about the State of the Union, because and that people don't want to hear lofty ideas. They want to hear how they're going to get out of various crises and what it is doing in terms of democracy across the Union.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And as I said, it's something we've been discussing in our group over the last week or two. I think one of the things we're missing there is the whole question of added value. It's not getting across at all. While the European Union is spending lots of money, it's never actually recognised. even things such as CAP. Recently, communication went out to farmers from CAP, telling them that they were going to get such payments on the October and more in December and so forth. There wasn't one mention of European funding in it. It was coming from the Department of Agriculture. And that's just one simple example. And unless that's addressed, and we can actually show where the added value is, it's going to get worse. Because there is a tendency by governments to appease nationalists, as we saw with the council meeting there a month ago. And it's happening in every single country across Europe. There's a movement somewhat to the far right. There's efforts being made to outflank them and to appease them. And I think Europe will suffer enormously unless we can actually look at this in a more objective fashion. And the Commission has to really lead in this and pull the Council over the coals when they're going down the nationalist route, because we'll finish up back where we were prior to the European Union starting at all. And it is a big danger, and I'm very concerned about it because it's almost creeping nationalism at this stage. And I think that meeting where they made monumental cuts to actually everybody know wonderful projects, even like Erasmus, it makes no sense. It has to be addressed.
Okay, and Barry Andrews, what's your contribution to that? And other questions have come in for you. But Barry, in terms of the state of the Union and what you've heard from some of our guests and the need for greater emphasis on democracy and for people's voices to be heard.
Yeah, well, look, I'm an optimist, Martina, and, you know, let's just take a look globally here. You know, look at the state of democracy in the United States. Look at the state of democracy in many other parts of the world and compare it to Europe. Yes, we have challenges in terms of respect for the rule of law in certain member states. There's no point in getting into the detail of that, and that is true. But our group are insistent on including a conditionality in the disbursement of EU funds that is related to the rule of law. And that will be part of the trilateral dialogue between the institutions over the next couple of weeks and months as we finalize the MFF. The only place in the world that is going to drive the Paris climate agenda is Europe. The only place in the world that is going to have the leverage to drive the sustainable development goals is in Europe, in the EU, I mean. And, you know, in terms of trade regulation, an area that I'm working in, you look at what's happening in China in terms of state-owned enterprises and the respect to the World Trade Organization rules. So Europe, we have to have confidence. And this then comes to the question around, you know, as Sean mentions, is this being communicated to people? Do people see this added value? You know, it's a perennial challenge for Europe to actually explain what happens there that's positive. You know, we talk about the unity of the European Union, by the way, Martina, and I'll just make a quick comment on Brexit and the chaos and nonsense that's coming out of Whitehall right now in Westminster is forging the EU unity, not just this week, but over the last 4 years. So the European Union has been able to speak with one voice. Leaving the European Union looks like a really bad idea. And sentiment towards membership of the Union is very high. Turnout at the last European Parliament election was extremely high. So yes, there are massive challenges, and COVID is the context in which all of that is happening. But I think the European Union will continue to be a leader geopolitically, and I think that will really strongly come out in President von der Leyen's speech next week.
Thank you very much, Barry. I know you have to leave at 10, and there are other questions coming in relation to Brexit, so I'm delighted that you touched on those, particularly given your role on that committee. So thank you very much. In terms of that theme of the State of the Union, I'm also going to ask Noelle about that, because you brought that up in yours, and you travel across the country, you talk to young people, and you talk to very many interested groups. Noelle, isn't an issue that's recurring, and it's coming up in our questions, it's coming up with our panelists today.
Yeah, absolutely, Martina. And I think it's something that we would reference quite a lot. We say that we tend to Europeanize failure and nationalize success. And that is always, as Barry mentioned there, it's always that million-dollar question of how to communicate and explain what the EU does. But to Danny's point about the state that it is currently in, I think we are facing huge challenges, but the flip side of those challenges are untold opportunities for the EU to put forward a very ambitious State of the Union address with practical, tangible roadmaps and solutions that can get the buy-in and support of all citizens across the different EU member states. And that in President von der Leyen's address, and I do, I do think that the EU and the institutions are prepared to concretely step up to the plate, because that is what people want. If the COVID pandemic and the challenges that we have outlined to our values and our multilateral global world order are under threat, it's now is the time that the EU has a unique opportunity to step into that breach and to step up and be that voice and to concretely enact measures that do that and make it a fairer, more sustainable union for everyone, which is what I think all of citizens want to see.
Now, Danny, I am going to revert to you on this issue, because you've heard the contributions of people responding to what you said, which were quite strong comments, and also some of the comments that we've got online. Do you think Ursula von der Leyen is the person at the time to push through change? Because she did outline that in her European Parliament address last week, the need for greater democracy, the need for a voice, and the need for change at EU Commission and at a European level.
Yeah, so I suppose my comments, Martina, were two parts about the state of something: is what place or role and what actual conditions in. And so some of the conditions that we're experiencing in the European Union right now from a business perspective are finding it hard to keep up with the changing globalization and the nature of intangible assets. So we've seen a couple of things from the European Commission that have been relevant to Ireland that have been pushed back on. The Apple tax judgment, for instance, the Schrems, on Facebook, on data, etc. And where lies that in terms of multilateralism? Like, I'm not actually sure I've really heard too much about the kind of competition between Paris for the corporation tax debate versus Brussels, multilateralism. So there's quite a number of specific things about place and subsidiarity, or whatever way you like to call it. And the conditions are, notwithstanding the rule of law issues that are going on, do we believe that the European Union economy actually is in a strong place? Contrast the results just this week of Ireland's positioning in terms of being a hub of globalization. Like, the likelihood is that history will show, in terms of GDP, it might be very difficult to even find COVID in the stats for 2020, because it looks like we'll have a very low single digit, or perhaps none of a drop when the dust settles on 2020, because it's this K-shape that's occurring, because we're overexposed to those globalization, pharma, medtech, and so on. And what's the union saying about that for the rest of the union? I'm involved in these debates, and I can't say I'd be able to crystallize what that is. So there's a lot of talk about what I call those lofty ideals, but actually the world is changing very dramatically. It's not even just about democracy, it's about the way that we actually are transacting now. I'm not sure that Europe is fully on the vanguard of that. It can be, has been in the past, but it's got dragged into nationalism even in those spaces. So state aid, broadly defined, I think should be discussed in the State of the Union.
Thank you. And obviously Brexit is another issue which business interests will be concerned about. Can I move on to a theme that's coming through in all of our questions? Whether it's David Minton, Director of the Northwest Regional Assembly, it's about leaving, I suppose, sectors or areas behind. And he is pointing to the principle of subsidiarity, and that should Ireland and the EU reaffirm their commitment to this principle, ensuring our regions are connected and region inequalities addressed. Others, like Paul Ginnell, is saying there should be an emphasis on the European Pillar of Social Rights and an implementation plan for that. In terms of Jerry O'Sullivan, there needs to be an emphasis, who is from the Erasmus and National Agency. He is saying that really there should be a focus on EU-wide education, and others have talked about inequality across the EU, tackling racism, unemployment. Isn't there very much a concern now that the EU really has to act in making sure that certain sectors and even certain regions aren't left behind? And I'm going to start with Patricia King there.
Yes, and just in contrast to maybe the points that Danny has made and the topic that you've introduced now, Martina, into this Just to say to you, the other side of this is that across Europe, you have very high levels of inequality. You have very high instances of low pay. By the way, I include Ireland in that as well, in particular sectors. And you have workers' inability to earn a decent wage, to earn even a minimum wage, a living wage, that they can have an income that they can live on. Now, if you have such, and their ability to do anything about that is very restricted. It's non-existent in Ireland. Because workers are denied a right to collectively bargain on behalf of their members. Trade unions are denied a right to do that, and workers can't do it. So if you have across the continent of Europe and across the EU swathes of people who are in conditions of very low pay, precarious working conditions, not able to have a decent income, what does that breed? That breeds all sorts of other social consequences. And if there is a pillar of social rights, there is little adherence to it in terms of its implementation. It is one of the key pieces to try and resolve the issues around Europe. Obviously, on top of that, you have a whole migrant issue. You're seeing some of it in Greece yesterday, and the horrific outcome there. So what I'm saying to you is, the EU, I agree with Danny, we're at a crucial stage in terms of the future of Europe. And if they don't grab hold of finding solutions, then all of those precarious conditions will just continue. And that will bring people to a very, very bad state. And I would think that we should seriously consider what the very negative outcomes of unbridled social inequality could bring to Europe. So I would hope that the EU President in her address will actually address that in a real way, so that we can start on a path of trying to repair some of these huge social inequalities that are so obvious across, including, by the way, in Ireland.
And by the way, some of the themes that you've raised there, Patricia, the Ambassador of Malta, Leonard Sacco, also has raised in a question, to expect any solidarity to frontline states regarding the challenges they face dealing with migration. So that is a key issue, while Kieran McCarthy, who represents Ireland on the EU Committee of the Regions, said there's a real need to push the social pillars debate. Many key issues, social rights, which you have been raising there. And I'm going to raise those with Deirdre Garvey, who represents the charity and not-for-profit sector here in Ireland as Chief Executive of the Wheel. Deirdre.
Thanks very much, Martina, and I welcome coming in here now, because I think picking up on something that was said earlier in terms of, do people understand the value? And indeed what Patricia also said about, I think we have a new definition of what an essential worker is. I think what the crisis has shown us is that we also have a new appreciation as to actually the what low pay and what community organisations can offer to actually getting through a health pandemic. So, and I guess what I want to point out is the fact that we are at a point of crisis. We have learned a huge amount, the visibility of how connected our communities are and how important they are to actually keep social cohesion and to keep civil order and to keep people alive at the very basic minimum. And I guess the unbalancing of the EU in recent years, whereby the pillar of social rights has been, I guess, slightly neglected, to put it kindly, in terms of an implementation plan. We do need to grasp the opportunity. We have, in one sense, a newfound value for the important things in life, being able to be alive, being able to be safe, being able to have enough, I guess, community and enough cohesion to actually live a life with dignity. And that requires work at the economic level, it requires work at the social level. And I guess our proposition and our desire would be that the EU learns from this situation and actually puts a sustainable plan for making the contribution of communities and people at the heart of our economic recovery, because we've seen it's possible in Ireland. Everything that was replicated during COVID and in Ireland has been seen all over Europe. There is a huge contribution to be resourced there that is not being resourced, and it is absolutely necessary to achieve the social equality that is needed, and it is absolutely necessary to make sure that people in Ireland and indeed Europe have access to the education that will bring economic prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to change tack, and there's been a lot of emphasis from some of our contributors, not surprisingly from Tim Cullinan about Brexit, but also about the new Common Agriculture Policy. And Tim, as President of the Irish Farmers Association, you may feel yourself in an unusual position this morning, because I did believe that Dr. Elaine Mcguff from the Environmental Pillar also had concerns about the new CAP policy. So I'm going to turn to you and to outline what you'd like to see in relation to CAP, because that's so important for Irish farmers.
Absolutely. And as I said already in my speech this morning, that we have a budget for Irish farmers. This is critical, because this money is dispersed right across rural Ireland, and it's keeping what we have to be very cognizant of here is keeping people in rural Ireland. If there's one lesson that we learned from COVID-19 is people living in crowded spaces in cities. We have a situation now where people want to move to rural Ireland. So we have to ensure that the next CAP budget is focused in a way that will sustain farming, particularly in the western seaboard of Ireland, where the terrain is challenging. So we need funding into those areas to ensure that farming can continue in those areas. But I just want to go back to the Green Deal and the farm to fork and biodiversity again. There's a number of measures in there that's going to reduce the output of food in Europe. And if there's one lesson we have to learn from COVID-19 is, like, food producers in Ireland and right across the EU were in the frontline service, because whenever you have a pandemic, like, in fairness, we have to acknowledge the health service and all the work that was done there. But without a proper supply of good quality nutritious food, well then it would be impossible to fight that pandemic and that battle that we are all fighting. And I just want to say as well, in Ireland, everybody put on the green jersey at the start of COVID. All the community organisations from the GAA, so every community, including ourselves and IFA, we all came together in rural Ireland and we fought this through and through. So just my final message to the President next week is that it needs to be fair and equitable, and we need to be very careful with the Green Deal that it does not distort the production of good quality food right across Europe.
And obviously the Just Transition funds will be important too, on how they're allocated, to help farmers, because she has stressed the preservation of rural areas and those who are working on the lands.
Absolutely, absolutely essential, that it is a just transition, and if there is going to be changes in this, and there needs to be the proper funding and the space and the time to do that as well.
Now I'm going to move straight across to Dr. Elaine Mcguff to give her an opportunity to respond to that, because I'm sure that she is very happy with a lot of what she is hearing already from Ursula von der Leyen in terms of the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategies. But can you take on board also Tim's concerns, Elaine?
Yes, absolutely. The interesting thing is that the environmental pillar and what Tim is saying would agree with each other quite a lot. We agree that the Western Seaboard does need investment, that farming on the western side of Ireland is very difficult. But what I would highlight in regard to that point is that the CAP system that we have is failing those farmers. Those farmers, at the annual wage of a dairy farmer in Ireland is 66,500. A cattle rearing farm is €9,000. So again, it also ties in with social justice. There is a massive disparity between what farmers are earning in Ireland. And what we would like to see is those farmers, those small farmers farming on very good quality, like biodiverse lands, would be rewarded for ecosystem services, for providing biodiversity, for protecting birds, for providing carbon storage. So what we need is to make being an ecologically sound farmer financially viable. And that requires a new deal between farmers, the government, retailers and consumers. Because we do know that food is very important, and coronavirus did very much show up how shaky our supply chains are. The argument that Ireland provides food for the world, on that, Ireland is actually a net importer of food. In 2017, we imported 72,000 tonnes of potatoes and 23 tonnes of cabbage. Now, I know there's things that we will need to import in Ireland, but potatoes and cabbages are not those type of things. What we do well is that we produce dairy. When I say do it well, I do it, that's purely in economic terms. We export 90% of the dairy that we produce. We are not food secure. So while myself and Tim would agree with each other in certain regards, I would say we need to take a good hard look at the food that we are producing and move towards food sustainability, which is socially just. The farmers, the poor farmers, need to be supported. We need to have food security, and it needs to be done in an ecologically sensitive way.
Thank you very much, Elaine. And a lot of questions coming in on broad issues such as reducing inequalities for those with disabilities to improving migrant conditions across the EU. But I am going to go back to a key issue, State of the Union, and also the key challenges facing it. Young people face a lot of challenges with in the aftermath of COVID. We're still living through it. Robert, what have you heard today in terms of the National Youth Council of Ireland's agenda would make you concerned, or that you feel that Europe is going in the right direction?
I think what's been great to hear is a theme from, I think, all participants of a desire for frankness in the State of the Union. That's been a common theme, and I think the European movement's own polling through the Red Sea, I think 1 or 2 years ago, framed Irish young people as some of the biggest, the most pro-EU demographic in Europe. And if we're not turning out to vote, you can try and draw some conclusions from that. And perhaps the EU is being presented in a way where it's not too seen as a malleable institution that people can engage with. So if the EU is discussed frankly by leading political figures, then people may be more willing to engage with it. I think during the debate on Brexit in the past few years, there's been, and with the fear of Euroscepticism across Europe, there's been a fear of having frank conversations about Europe. There's been an uncritical presentation of it. And if we have frank discussions about Europe, if we discuss it, warts and all, then I think more people are going to be willing to actually engage with it as a project, because it's a project, it's an ongoing conversation. It's not perfect, and we shouldn't treat it as such.
And we are still getting questions to this very point as we draw to a close on agricultural unfair trading practice in the agricultural and food supply chain, what can happen there, and from the CEO of the Irish Exporters, Simon McKeever. We have so many questions today, but so limited time, but we've had so many different voices. I am going to go back through the panel and ask them for one comment each, which is the most difficult thing you could ask in terms of their concerns of what's happening in relation to Brexit. I'm going to start with the MEP, Sean Kelly. And very briefly, we're literally going to run through the panel because it is the big elephant in the room this week. Sean.
Yeah, it's a huge worry. And we're still hoping that there will be a deal. But even if there is a deal, it's going to be very difficult for Ireland, regardless. And that's some point we must make. I'm delighted the government has published its bill in relation to how we're going to deal with it. And I do hope that Johnson and his friends are actually only engaging in brinkmanship and they don't clash out. Because if they do, it's going to be calamitous for us.
Okay, Noelle O'Connell, that's a theme that you will also be very interested and concerned about.
Yes, Martina, as Sean said, that there is a deal, that the unity of the EU27 remains strong, that the solidarity is there, but equally that we don't see detrimental damage to British-Irish relations, and that hopefully we ensure an outcome that mitigates against the worst impacts that Brexit is undoubtedly going to cause.
Danny McCoy, this is coming at a time when Irish businesses don't need any more uncertainty. What has the response been like from your members, or what are your concerns at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's true. Look, nobody wants uncertainty, but actually, to our best, it's done quickly now at this point. There is no transition period. Let's just nail that. The transition period was that Britain was to leave like they did on the 31st of January, and that we'd know the future state that we're traveling to, and the transition was in that knowledge to move towards it. So effectively, there is no transition period, and that's now a certainty. So I think that's probably the one message, is that we're going to have to do this in one fell swoop, and it will be awkward, but I think everybody just wants to get it done at this point.
And Tim Cullinan, this is also of concern to Irish farmers who have enough on their agenda at the moment as it is.
Try and avoid a scenario where there is a no deal, and this is very worrying at the moment. But in the worst case scenario, we want to try and ensure that there's a limited deal, that there's not tariffs on goods going from Ireland into the UK. And the other key concern I have is the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. I think a lot of valuable work has been done over the years to remove the friction around that border. I think that is absolutely critical in this deal. We do not want going back to where we were in the 90s in Ireland.
Thank you very much, Tim. Robert, for young people, this is a time of huge uncertainty, and obviously with fears of unemployment and the job scenario, education and all the like, this Brexit uncertainty doesn't help in terms of their future outlook.
No, and I think that going forwards, we are facing into a crisis with Brexit, and the unique position and access of the voluntary community in healing any social divide. Yes, economic and rule of law concerns and trade concerns are also vital, but there's also a very human, social level, and the voluntary sector is uniquely placed to empower communities and grassroots to connect and heal any divides and prevent divides from occurring. And within that, at a European level, EU programs, EU youth programs are essential in this regard. Erasmus Plus funding, research through the Horizons project, these really, we can't afford to see these cut in the upcoming framework. Yep.
Thank you very much, Robert. Deirdre, Garvey, this comes at an unsettling time as well for the Irish charity sector, which is already facing a huge dip in fundraising, to put it very mildly.
Yes, indeed, and it's charities and community voluntary organisations that pick up the pieces. We are, in one sense, the social safety net of very last resort. And we are about community resilience. In one sense, the damage of Brexit has already been done. You know, Danny says it's best we're done quickly. And in one sense, it's already done. The damage to the trust and the uncertainty in people's lives, because this is really disastrous, what's happening now for cohesion, and it's really dangerous for lives and for the life of people, particularly in those border counties and indeed on either side of the border. And you mess with cultural identity at your peril, and that's what's going on here. And communities are and will be severely negatively impacted by the cavalier messing with cultural identity, and it is doubly important for those community organisations to band together.
Thank you. And I'm moving on to Patricia King, General Secretary of ICTU. Patricia, obviously this would be of concern to workers and jobs and employment.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. We're in the final and compression stages now of these negotiations, which will end at the end of October. And as a person who's negotiated throughout my whole career, I can tell you that people do very strange and dangerous things in the final stages of negotiations, and we're seeing that being played out now. If there is a no deal, and particularly with the Northern Ireland Protocol and one side being prepared to break international law to get their own way, that could have severe consequences across the island of Ireland for a number of reasons we haven't time to go into. And then a no-deal Brexit will also have very strong economic and social consequences, including the loss of jobs and including bringing us back to a very, very bad economic place. So there are big stakes here for Ireland. And to be fair, the solidarity in the EU has been very useful and helpful in Ireland. But these last 6 weeks now are going to be crucial for the future of our nation.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Dr. Elaine Mcguff from the Environmental Pillar, what about your concerns of what's happening now in terms of Britain leaving the EU?
Am I muted?
Sorry, Elaine, I think you're muted there.
Thank you, sorry. Obviously, Ireland is a single landmass, and lowering of environmental standards in Northern Ireland would have huge ramifications for us. Pollution doesn't respect borders, and it would also undermine our EU obligations there's water bodies that cross the border, and under the Water Framework Directive, it would be very hard for us to reach those objectives if Northern Ireland is in somewhat of a race to the bottom with environmental standards. So it's a really very significant concern from an environmental point of view.
Thank you very much. And by the way, thank you to all our guest speakers, our audience, and to our organisers this morning, the European Parliament Liaison Office in Dublin, the European Commission Representation in Ireland, and the European Movement in Ireland. I think you can all agree that we've had a very diverse, frank, insightful discussion on the various Irish priorities and also beliefs in relation to the state of the European address. And there's something is coming true very clear. No matter what sector you represent, you want your voice heard at EU level. And maybe for there to be less, I suppose, bureaucracy in relation to that. Now, next Wednesday, the 16th of September, starting at 5 to 8 in the morning, you can join us for a live streaming of the State of the Union address by the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, followed by expert analysis and discussion. That event is being jointly organised by the European Commission President Representation in Ireland, the European Parliament Liaison Office in Dublin, in conjunction with the Institute of International and European Affairs. So there's no reason not to be up on all things Europe at the moment. Thank you all very much for your time. In a very tight period of time, we got so many views in, and yet they're not very different. Thank you.